Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf samach, a very interesting daf. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in honor of her beloved daughter Becky on the occasion of her marriage to Maor. May they live together in good health and happiness for the rest of their lives and build a bayit ne'eman b'Yisrael. Today's daf is sponsored by Terry Kravosha and Rabbi Chaim Herring for the refuah shlema of Gita Dalia Bat Yafa. Okay, with that we're going to get started. We were in the middle of our stories of Rabbi Yehoshua and the Kesar and the kind of showdown between them. If you remember, the first story was he wanted to see this creature, this aryeh, this tigris, which was the lion of this Bei Ila'ah, this fantastical creature, and he says, you can't, and then he says, I want to show me anyway, and then he says, fine, and as the lion starts getting closer, this creature starts getting closer, it wreaks havoc, and finally, after the second time, when it directly affects, right, it sounds a little like in Egypt with Paro, right, and Makapa Chorod, he finally said, okay, enough, as soon as it really reached him, said, okay, please ask for mercy, right? Please take it back. And he asked for mercy. This Bai Rachameh is going to come up a lot in today's daf. And Rabbi Yehoshua asked for mercy, and the creature goes away. Okay, second story. Amar le Kesar le Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananya. Be'ina di'echse le'lohaychu. Okay, we're at the very bottom of Nun Ted Mabet. I want to see your God. Amar le lo matzit chazit le. You can't. Okay, a lot of this also, one of the words that comes up here a lot is matzi, you can't. Okay, he says you can't do that. Amar le, Ivra chazina le. No, really, I want to see him. Let me see him. Azal ok melahade yoma b'tkufa Tamuz. He took him on a day in the summer months and took him, the yoma here means the sun. He took him to see the sun. Amar le, istikalbe. So we took a day, right, in Tkufa Tamuz again, we have a lot of Tkufa Tamuz here. In the summer months, he takes him to a day where the sun's very strong, and he says, go look at the sun. Amarle, lo matzina. So this time, the Roman Caesar says, the Roman emperor says, I can't look at it, right? I can't, I'm not able to, right? This lo matzina again, right? So all the time was Rabbi Yehoshua saying, you can't, and he said, no, I can. And now he says, I can't look at the sun. Amarle, yoma, the day, which really means the sun, it's just one of the many servants that God has that serve God. And you said you can't look at it. Right? All the more so God's presence you can't look at. Right? If you can't look at one of the servants of God, for sure you won't be able to look at God himself. And with that, the story ends. I want you to notice that in this case, there's no response by the Caesar. Because we're going to compare some of the stories. There's differences between them. I don't know necessarily the meaning of them, but in this one, the Caesar doesn't respond. Amar le Kesar le Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananya. So again, the emperor says to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananya, Be'ina di'itzbele nahama le'elohaychu. I want to make a nice meal for your God. Amar le lo matzit. He said, you won't be able to. Amai, why not? He has too many servants working for him, too many chayalim, right? Soldier, it literally translates as soldiers. There's too many people serving him. I was thinking the way people say, right, it's enough to feed an army, right? That's what they're basically saying, right? Like an army of people. He has an army of people with him. There's no way you can make enough food to feed them. Amarle Ivra, he said, no, I want to. Okay, Amar Le, so Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, Pok Savit Legida de Revita, go by the banks of the river Revita, de Ravich Alma. There's a lot of space, and you can make food and put it out there, and it's a great spot to put it. Now, obviously, you know that putting something by the water is not necessarily the best spot. Well, Tarech Shita Yarche Kaita, so he worked hard all the 6 months of the summer. Right, obviously summer is 3 months, but they mean, there's always summer versus winter, okay? 6 months of summer, right? The warmer months and the colder months. So we worked 6 months of the summer. Ata zika kanshe liyama. Along came a wind after he cooked food for 6 months. Along came a wind and swept it all into the sea. Tarach shita yarchi de sitva. So then he worked another 6 months in the winter. Ata mitra. Came the rain, tabe biyama, and drowned it in the ocean, okay, or in the sea. So now all his food is gone. Amarle mai hai, he said, what was that all about? Amarle, Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, Hainu kanoshai zalochai da'atu kameh. That was all eaten by the sweepers and by the floor washers. Okay, why the sweepers and the floor washers were sweepers, like the wind sweeps things away. And the floor washers, you might remember, we learned about this ziluf that they used to do, which they would throw water on the ground to clean it, because a lot of their floors were made of just dirt, like dust and soil, and they would throw water on it. That was a method of cleaning it. So the rain coming down is like what they call here the zolochai, which are the people who throw water on the floor to clean it. Basically, you fed the cleaners, which is an interesting, right? What's he basically saying? You worked so hard. All you got to was the first level of servants, right? Those who clean it. You might say the cleaners are the most important, but often they're kind of lowest on the totem pole. And basically, those are the ones that you manage to feed with all your hard work. Amar le ihachi lo matzina. Now, in this case, you have the response. That's why I wanted to compare this to the previous. In the previous one, he doesn't say, I can't do it, right? He actually said, I can't do it when he was looking at the sun. Maybe that's why. Because the I can't do it comes earlier in the story. But he never says, oh, well, I can't look at God then. But here he says, oh, I can't do it. If that's the case, and all I did in that entire year of work was feed the cleaners, well, I can't do, there's no way I could serve at God's table. Okay, now we move on to the Bat Kesar. Amrle Bat Kesar le Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananya, the daughter of the emperor, says to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananya, Eloheichon nagarahu. Your God is a carpenter. Why is he a carpenter? Dichtiv hamikare b'mayim aliotav. Okay, he makes a ceiling with the water of his places, his high abodes. Okay, this is in Barchi Nafshi. So the point is, mikare is someone who builds a ceiling, okay, or some people call it beams, okay, whatever it is, he does building. So now your God is like a carpenter. Okay, there's a footnote in the Quran that quotes a source that talks about that maybe what's going on here is what she's saying is your God didn't really create the world, because creating the world, a carpenter just takes things that exist and builds them, and that's what God did. But he actually didn't create the world from the beginning. The world existed, and God took things that were in the world and moved them around, built them, formed them, but he's just a carpenter. So if that's the case, Eimale denavi lechad mistorita. Well, I wanted to make me a distaff, which was this tool that was used for spinning, a very simple tool, okay? And what she's basically saying, it's interesting, if you compare her story to the stories of the emperor wanted the grandiose. I want to see the lion that you're talking about, this crazy lion. I want to see God. I want to make a meal for God. She's just saying, well, look, if your God is in the world, and now I think what's going on here is also the concept of hashgacha, of God's presence in the world, besides she's relating to creation, and basically saying God didn't really create the world, but not only did not really create the world, but God isn't really present in the world. How do I know? Well, she said, if your God is, this carpenter, and the royal carpenter, built this amazing world out of whatever, let's say, existed before, but is just really a carpenter, but he should be able to make me something as simple as a distaff. Okay, it's one of the most simple items, and she's trying to say, your God can't do that, right? It's not going to make me, right? I can't just say, God, make me something, and it happens, right? It doesn't work that way. Which is also her way of saying, maybe God didn't even really create the world, like even in her version of it, where he was just a carpenter that formed things, but even that, like God can't do that. Amar, now, instead of responding like the other ones, oh, I can't do that, right? There's a different request. He says, sure, l'chaye, I'll do that. So what did he do? And he does it. And if you think about hashgacha in the word, right? Hashgacha doesn't work. I ask for something and it flies down, right? It falls down from the heavens. But things happen in other ways. And this is really about the ways of God. By rachamei alei v'in ga'a. So we praise for her, and this is not exactly right, the thing you want to pray for, and she gets leprosy. Now, why leprosy? You'll understand in a minute. Otvuha b'shuka de Romi. He seats her. She ends up getting put into the shuk of Romi. She sits in the middle of the marketplace. V'yav v'le mistorita, and they give her a distaff. Okay, why? Because dehavu nihige, the custom in Rome was dechol de minage beromi yavu le mistorita v'yad b'shuka v'sar tadolale. All the people, and in a minute you'll understand why, all the people who get leprosy in Rome, what do they do? Instead of, this is also comparing what they do and what we do, right? We put people outside the machaneh. They put them in the most public place, in the shuk, and they give them a distaff, and they have them take out all the knots from the wool. Kihechi delichzu inashe, so people will see them, v'libai rachamei alei, and they'll pray for them, for mercy for them, because leprous people are really in a bad state, and they'll pray for mercy. So they actually put them in a very public spot so that people pray for them. notice here, okay, there's a lot of literary things we're going to point out today. The Levi Rachame, right? This is the Romans do something, so the people beg for mercy for these people. And in all the stories, right, Rabbi Yehoshua ends up asking Rachamim anytime he wants to ask something from God. He asks it from God in that way. So this time, it's the Romans do this. Now, Yom Echad, so basically, he leaves the scene, right? She gets leprosy. She ends up getting taken to the shuk, and she gets the distaff exactly as she wanted. Or maybe not exactly as she wanted. It wasn't exactly the way she was hoping to get it. Yom Echad, Havakachali Patam. One day, Rabbi Yehoshua happens to be in the shuk of Rome, and in the marketplace. Amarle, Shvirta Mistorita Diav Lech Elohai. Are you pleased with the distaff that God gave you? Amrale, Aimale Elohayach Lishko Mai Diav. Tell your God to take away what he gave me. I'm not really pleased with it. And what does he answer her? Now, and I just want to remind you, before we get to the next line, what happened in the first story, right? His throne gets overturned, and all these teeth fall out of people, and all these terrible women miscarry, and he says, enough, take it away. And Rabbi Yehoshua prays for mercy and takes it away. But in this story, Amar La, he says to Allah Didan Me'av Yav, our God gives, but Mishkalo Shakil, but he doesn't take away. Sorry, there's nothing I could do, it's too late. And that ends these 4 stories. So let's try to make a little order, a little kind of concept, thoughts about this. I'm happy to have people share with me also their thoughts on these stories. I think there's a lot of interesting things here. Obviously, there's some polemics here between, the Greco-Romans and the Jews, and that there's a whole series of stories of that going on. But I think more than that, there's this idea, first of all, in the last story for sure, it's about God's presence in the world, right? And how Hashgacha works, right? Things don't work that we ask directly and, get what we want, but doesn't work in that kind of way. I think the themes often here are the wonders of God and how we don't really understand them, right? We want to understand them, we want to see them, but we can't really, and we have to just believe, right? There's a certain amount of belief here. The Roman, the emperor doesn't want to just believe, right? He wants to see. We can't always see, right? We have to. It's about believing. If we talk about, the polemics here and sort of what typifies us against the other nations, it's actually in a perfect location here in laws of kashrut, right? Which is this idea of if you remember the psukim there say it's to separate, right? Kedoshim, we're sanctified, which means basically we're separated by eating differently, right? That we do things differently than other nations, and this makes us sanctified. And I think maybe here they're also talking about the differences between us and the other nations. We're going to talk about a lot the theme of creation of the world. So Gita, you said before, that was also something we said yesterday about be careful what you wish for. I'm looking at what else you're saying. The Romans praying for someone who, right, the story of Rabbi Ishmael of the Harugei Malchut, okay, and the beauty, how beautiful he was, and then his skin ended up being mutilated, okay, and the Romans praying for someone who performs a function, right? That's interesting. Only for someone who actually does something, okay. I understood that as they want people to be, right? The question is what that's doing there. I thought just in general, again, the difference, and it's actually interesting because it sounds like a nice idea that they put them in the shuk so that people will pray for mercy. Didn't sound like a negative thing, even though the rest of this is kind of negative about them. I like the difference between he's looking for the grand, she's looking for the simple, right? Both of them don't really get what they want. And it's this idea that you can find God in simple things in the world, right? And how just all sorts of ways that God orchestrates the way things go in the world. Anyway, these are some thoughts. I think in the end also the theme here is really about humility, right? Because the Romans are perceived as really not humble, and the Jews are about humility. It kind of connects with having belief and not saying I have to know everything. That goes hand in hand with having humility, and I think that that's a big theme in this story. Understanding the greatness of God and that we're just very small beings in this big world. Okay, we're going to move on. You can have other thoughts and share them. You can email me them. Always happy to hear. Okay, we'll also come back maybe to some of these ideas as we go through the daf, because we're going to get to all sorts of other things that connect. But right now, it seems like we're moving on, and the other thing, I actually wanted to say one more thing. this idea of humility, I think, is very important in the concept, and humility going with we don't understand everything, and that we have to just believe. It fits very well in the theme of this chapter, because even if we talk about yesterday, and we mentioned about these grasshoppers that, a certain type that the Moroccans eat, and then the others say, no, we don't eat that. That's not kosher. And a lot of the laws of both kashrut, okay, whether we talk about, signs of what's a kosher bird, where we don't really know, right? But we don't sorry, it's coming up on my Zoom. Okay, where we don't really know what's really the sign of a kosher bird or kosher grasshopper, right? These are things that were passed on by tradition. Some of them are explicit in the Torah, like the fish and the animals, but the others are not explicit in the Torah, and there's a lot of tradition around it. And if we go back to the beginning of the chapter of the treifot, right, we say, oh, these treifot were given to Moshe, right? They're definitely not written in the Torah at all. And there's a lot here of what we're talking about, and we're going to talk later about the idea of Torah min hashamayim and the whole idea of Torah being from God, and just kind of believing all this stuff. There's a lot in what we do that requires a certain amount of trust in the system and belief in the traditions. And for that, you can't go with the emperor's approach. Look, I don't see it, so I can't do it, right? And this is the rabbi's approach to saying, no, you have to believe in the tradition and don't expect that you're going to understand everything and have proof for everything. It doesn't work that way. So I think that's also connecting it to the concepts that we're learning here and why this story specifically appears here, which is always a question when you have a Agadah, what it's doing here. Okay, we're going to move on, but you'll see we're going to get back to lots of Agadah today. So I'm a Rav Yehuda. Now, because we were talking about animals and signs of animals, so he says, Shul, Chastan uparsetan, Rav Reshe v'Rav Genuvte. Okay, a shore has a big stomach and big hooves, large hooves, and, right, an ox we're talking about, large head and large tail. V'chilufa b'chamra. And in a donkey, everything's the opposite. Small stomach, small hooves, small head, and small tail. L'may nafkamina, why are we telling you this? L'mekach u'memkar. If you go buy a shore in the shuk, and you get one that has a small stomach, or something, small head, or something like that, you could say, look, this isn't what I ordered. Okay, give me back that one and give me a different one. Apropos the idea of a shore, so now we're going to get to some other statement, and Rav Yehuda was saying it, now Rav Yehuda is going to say another statement, and from here we're going to get back to the creation of the world. V'amar Rav Yehuda, shor she'ikriv Adam HaRishon, keren echat hayta lo b'mitzcho. Okay, the shore that Adam HaRishon, there's this tradition that Adam HaRishon brought a shore for a sacrifice, and we're going to see a reference to it in a chapter in Tehillim. It had one horn. Okay, again, back to this one-horned creature. Shenemar v'tetiv la'Hashem mishor par makrin mafris. Okay, very hard pasuk to understand. And this will be better to God from the shore par. From which shore par? The shore par that Adam HaRishon brought. Okay, so we're saying like our sacrifices will be better to God than even the one that Adam HaRishon brought. How do they describe it? Makrin mafris. So what do they explain about makrin? Makrin. So they say makrin means it had one horn. From keren. So they say, makrin tarte mashma. When things have a yud nun at the end, it's like yud mem at the end of a Hebrew word, and that means plural. So makrin sounds like plural ones. Now, it's not exactly true because the yud nun here isn't the plural form of it, right? It's makrin, the nun is part of the root, but anyway, they're saying it looks like it's plural. Amrav Nachman makrin k'tiv without a yud, or makran k'tiv, depends how you pronounce it, but the point is it doesn't have a yud in the Torah, and therefore, okay, I didn't check, by the way, if someone wants to check how it appears by us, because sometimes we have the malay and chaser and it doesn't appear the same by us. But anyway, it says it without the yud, and that means it's singular. Okay, so in Tehillim, this is in Tehillim Samach Tet, Pasuk Lamebed, if anyone wants to check. Yeah, it looks like here from the Torah or that it's written without a yud. Okay, so the point being that it's singular, and that means it had one horn. Now, again, darshaning that pasuk, what's this? Makrin mafris. Mafris means it has hooves, right? Makrin means it has a horn. This goes back to our horns and hooves that we were talking about in the previous sugya. Amar Rav Yehuda, shor shekriv Adam HaRishon, karnav kodmot leparsotav. The horns came out before the hooves. Now, this means two things. Number one, it means that when the animal was born, normally there's actually a cute picture in the Koran, or I don't know, cute. Some people might think it's a little scary looking, but it's showing an animal in utero, and just a sketch of it. And it's showing that when the animal comes out of the womb, it's got its hooves out first. So it comes head first, but with the hooves in front of it. So the hooves come out, right? The arms, kind of like their arms extended. The hooves come out first in an animal when an animal's born. So now they say, well, here the horns came out first. Now this means two things. Number one, it happened in a different manner because usually the hooves come out first, and this time the horns came out first. The head goes out first. But not only that, horns usually develop later. So they're not usually in utero. They don't have horns. So this was a miraculous thing that, number one, the horns were actually in existence at the time. This is all Rashi says. And number two, that the horns actually came out before. Because you can't have the horns come out first if they weren't in existence at the time. So that's the Karnav Kodmot Leparsotav. How do you know this? Shenemar. Makrin mafris. First makrin, then mafris. That's why the keren comes first and then the horns. Makrin bereisha v'hadar mafris. Okay, first makrin, then mafris. Misayeh le Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and this supports the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. De'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, kol ma'aseh b'reshit b'komatam nivru, b'da'atan nivru, b'tzivyonam nivru. Okay, by the way, we're back to the idea of creation and how miraculous creation was, going against, if we take that interpretation, that what she was trying to say, the daughter of the emperor, that there was no real creation, or it certainly wasn't the way we describe it, right? This is saying our version of creation was that God created creatures in their full height, in their full knowledge. Okay, but datan, there's different interpretations. Either it means they had their knowledge like as if they were mature already. Some people think that it means, Rashi says, that it means that God, they knew they were being created. That God took advice with them. Okay, how this could happen, good question, but that God advised with them before they were created, and they were created with their own will. They all agreed, oh yes, I want to be created. And then b'tzivyonam, Rashi says, Tivyonam has many different interpretations. Rashi says it means that Tivyonam is really in their form. So either it means they were in full form already. Some people say it was they were in full beauty, like the most beautiful horse was created in Breshit. Sometimes you have uglier ones and beautiful ones. So, it was the most beautiful horse and the most beautiful this. But Rashi says what it means is bidmut shebacharu lahem. It was they got to choose the way they wanted to be created, what they wanted to look like. Okay, so that's this drasha about the Briat HaOlam, and that fits with the fact that the horns were already there because they were fully mature when they were born, which normally that's not the case. Darash Rabbi Chanina bar Papa. If we're already on creation, we're now going to talk about some psukim that are a little bit, you'll notice something that you probably never noticed before unless you've seen this midrash. But in Breshit Aleph, verses 11 and 12, okay, I say you might not have seen it because it's not something you really pay attention to. Vayomer Elohim, Tachea Aretz Desha Esev Mazria Zehara, Eitz Pri Oseh Pri Lamino. Okay, when the grass was created and the trees were created, so it says, God said, first God says, and then it's going to happen. So the first pasuk is God saying that the land will bring forth grass, okay, that will have seeds. Eitz Pri Oseh Pri Lamino. Now, the word Lamino is going to be our key word here, and trees that are each according to their type. So notice that it only says according to their type by the trees, not by the grass. It didn't say let me know in the part about the grass. The next pasuk says, and it actually happens, Vatotzea aretz desha esev mazria zera liminehu, each according to their type, by the grass. And then it says, ve'etz oseh pri, and the trees, asher zar obo liminehu. So it says the grass grew, each according to its type, and the trees grew, each according to its type. Now, what does it mean, each according to its type? Well, we know there's a issue of shatnez and kilayim, right? Kilayim is not planting two types of things together. You're not allowed to plant them together. So, we say here, so let's start now with the drasha. That's the background. So, what it meant is they each grew each type separately. There was no crossbreeding here. Yichvod Hashem la'olam yismach Hashem b'ma'asav. God's glory will be in the world, and God will be pleased with his creations. That's the focus on the pasuk. God will be happy with his creations. When was that? Pasuk zeh sar ha'olam amaro. Okay, the malach who was in charge of creation of the world, or the malach in charge of the world, said the following. B'sha'ah shamar kadosh baruch hu lemineu be'ilanot. And when God said about the ilanot, it actually should be lemino, because lemino appears in the first pasuk. God said lemino, each according to your type, by the trees. Nas'u desha'im kavachomer ba'atzmam. The grass made a kal v'chomer. What did they say? Im ritzono shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'rubuvya. Look, if God wanted things to be crossbreeded, Lama amar leminoba ilano. Why did he say the word leminoba to the trees? In other words, they heard God say the trees should do each in its own type. So obviously God wants everything to be separated. If he wanted them to be together, he wouldn't have said each tree should grow separately. Ve'od kavachomer, and a further kavachomer, they said, Umay ilano she'ein darkan latseper ubuvya. If the trees, which anyway don't really go combined together because each tree stands separately, right? You can't plant two trees right next to each other. They won't grow properly. So in any case, they're usually not crossbreeded, but each tree has its own space. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu lemino, and God said lemino, anu alacha kam v'kama. So grass, which grows right next to each other, all the more so we have to be careful, right? Because the trees don't really have to be careful. They're anyway separate. So we have to really be careful and make sure not to put two types right next to each other. So miyad kol echad v'echad yatsa lemino. So each one came out, right? Grew by itself. Patach Sar Ha'olam Ba'amal. At that moment, the Sar Ha'olam said, Yehi chvod Hashem la'olam, Yismach Hashem b'masav. God was so pleased with his creature, with the things, with the grass that he created, how wise they were, and that they realized, they understood what he meant. And that's what we learned from that pasuk. So by Ravina wants to know, Hirkiv, if you graft, Shnei Dishayim Zalzeh. Now, if we go back to talking about kilayim, so the prohibition of kilayim is not to put your vine with your seeds, right? Not to plant grains next to vines and things like that. Never says anything about grass. So he says, what if you graft two pieces, right? Two types of grass, zel gabezeh, turning now to Amud Bet, li Rav Chanina bar Papa mahu. According to Rav Chanina bar Papa, who said that the grass made this kavachomer and God agreed to what they did. Kevan de lo katabe liminehu, Lo mechayev, since it didn't say lemineu by them, or lemino, it really should be here. Since it didn't say lemino in the first pasuk, do we say, well, God didn't say it had to be that way, so there's no obligation, right? It's not a problem. There's no prohibition for doing it. Or do we say, since God in the end agreed with them, maybe it became prohibited? And the answer is, teku. We don't really know. Okay, this is, by the way, really talking about the interaction between, it's not humans, it's the grass, but it's about the interaction between the creations of the items that are created in the world and the creator. And here it's showing the ability of the creation, the ones that are created, to have influence on the creator, right? Which talks about the balance between, how this works, which maybe is going to be affected also later when we talk about Torah min hashamayim, right? Did Moshe write the Torah? Did God write the Torah? Sort of this interaction between humans and God. Okay. And this kind of ends with a bit of a question. Like, do we have the ability to influence God or not? And obviously, what's this couched in? The prohibition of kilayim, which is if we cross two different types of items and we graft them or whatever, right, all the different methods, that's basically we're trying to be creators, and that's a problem. That's why it's prohibited. We can't cross that line, but what line can we, what's permitted, what's not permitted, it's tricky. Okay. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi Rami. Okay, we're going to bring another pasuk about creation, and this one has a contradiction. K'tiv vayas Elohim et shnei ha'marot hagdolim. God created the two big items that are going to light up the world. What is that? The sun and the moon. But it also then says in the same pasuk, et ha'ma'or gadol ve'et ha'ma'or katan. It says the big one and the small one. Wait a minute. Didn't it just say a second ago they were two large ones? How did we end up with one being big and one being small? Right? Obviously the small is the moon because the moon gets smaller. Amra yareach lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The moon said to God, it's very famous, Ribono Shalom, efshar l'shnei melachim sheyishtamshu b'keter echad. How can you have two marot gdolot? Right? Gdolim. How can you have that? Two good big leaders? We all know you need one leader. You can't have two leaders. They're going to fight all the time. Who's in charge? Who gets to decide? Right? You can't have two kings sharing one crown. Amar Lasa, what did God say? Oh, you're complaining? Right? You have a question? Fine. So make yourself smaller. Right? And that's the reason why the moon got smaller. Okay, there's different traditions about why the moon got smaller. This is one of them. Amra lefanav, Ribono shel olam, ho'il v'amarti lefanecha davar hagun, ema'etet atzmi. The moon says, I don't understand, God. I said something pretty reasonable. I asked you a good question, and now you're going to punish me? That seems very unfair. Amar la, so God realized that really was a bit of a mistake, and this is a fascinating midrash because it shows that God makes mistakes. We're going to talk about that. L'chiyu mishol b'yom u'balayla. So he tries to give a consolation prize. He says, fine, you'll be around during the day and the night, and the sun will only be around during the day. Amrale, My revute. The moon says, that's not going to help me. Dishrega batira, mayahane. What's it going to help to be out during the day? No one can see me, right? A light in the daylight doesn't, right? The sun's going to obviously, blind everyone from being able to see me. Amarle, fine. So God says, I'll give you something else. Zeal, don't worry. Go and limnu bach Yisrael yamim v'shanim. The Jews will count, their calendar will be based on the lunar calendar. They'll count days and years based on you. Amarle, the moon said, Yom Anami, the days also, Yefshar de lo manu beit kufata. But you have to count seasons, and the calendar goes by the sun as well. So that doesn't mean it's not going to be only me. It's going to be the sun and the moon. That's why calendar is based on the sun and the lunar calendar and the solar calendar, because holidays have to come out in the right season. As we know, as it says in the pasuk, right, in also in the description of the creation here, Vahayu le'otot u'lemoadim u'liyamim u'lishanim. Right, they're going to be the signs for the holidays, for the days, for the years, both the sun and the moon. So that doesn't help me. Zil, likrut tzadike b'shmech. So go, don't worry, I got it. I'll call tzadikim in your name. You'll call them or katan. I'm going to call all sorts of tzadikim katan. Like Yaakov katan, Shmuel katan, David katan. Okay, they were all called the small one. Okay, that's in your name. Chazia de lo kamiyat vadate. Okay, that clearly didn't satisfy the moon. God sees the moon is not satisfied by any of the suggestions that he makes, and there's really nothing he can do. So, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Haviu kapara alai shemi'atati etayarech. This is a fascinating line. God says, I need atonement for what I did, that I made the moon small, I made a mistake, and I need atonement for it. By the way, this is, again, going back to those stories that you can't necessarily change everything, right? Not everything is reversible. So this was irreversible, like in the stories with the Caesar, right? Certainly with the daughter of the Caesar. V'hainu da'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and this fits in with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, Ma nishtana se'ir shel Rosh Chodesh, shene'abar bo la'Hashem. Most of the korban chatats that we bring are called a chatat. The se'ir that we bring on Rosh Chodesh is called chatat la'Hashem. Now we assume, what does that mean? A sin offering for God, meaning for us to bring for God. But what does it mean for God? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, se'ir ze yehe kapara alai shemi'atati etayarech. Every Rosh Chodesh, when the moon is at its smallest, God has to bring atonement for the fact that he made the moon small. Fascinating midrash. Okay, how do we relate to this? Well, God makes mistakes, God, right? So one of the ways to look at it is that they're using this as a way for us to learn, right? We're supposed to imitate God. And if this is how God behaves, then we also have to realize that we make mistakes and that we have to fix our mistakes and we have to ask for atonement for our mistakes and that, we have to try to compensate when we get someone upset, but it doesn't always work. And then the only thing that's left is to ask for atonement. But it's sort of describing, it's sort of a personification of God, which, is somewhat problematic to do. But in the world of Midrash, that's allowed. And it's just using it as an example for how we should behave, not necessarily that God really made a mistake. So anyway, it's very interesting Midrash. We're going to move on. Another issue with creation, and this has to do with the grass again. Back to the grass. Rav Asi Rami, he says there's another contradiction in creation. K'tiva totzeh aretz deshe. Okay, the grass was when was grass created? Bitzlat b'Shabbat, on the third day of the week. Uktiv. Now, in the beginning of chapter 2, in the second version of creation, it says v'chos siach hasadeh terem yeh ba'aretz. There was nothing growing yet in the land. And that was b'malei Shabbat. That was on Erev Shabbat. Now, it doesn't say there specifically it was on Erev Shabbat, but what happens there? It says, well, there wasn't there, and then talks about the creation of man. So, what do you have there? There, it seems like it must have been on the sixth day when man was created, and there was no grass. How could there have been no grass if the grass was created already on the third day? So, what do they answer? B'milamed shiatzu d'sha'im v'amdu al petach hakarka. Okay, the grass came out, but they weren't really out yet. It was created, but it was under the ground and couldn't get out yet. Ad sheba adam harishon ubikesh alehem rachamim. Okay, so now, right, so the land created grass, but it was underneath the ground, and only when Adam was created, he was able to then pray for the grass to come out. V'yardu geshamim, and the rain came, v'tzamchu, and it grew. Which, by the way, is the way grass grows, right? It's under the ground first, and then it comes out. And then they say, Lelamdecha, what's the purpose of this drasha? To explain, Shakadosh Baruch Hu mitavet l'tfilatan shel tzadikim, that God wants the prayers of the righteous people. And that's why God didn't bring the grass out yet until Adam Rishon prayed. Rav Nachman bar Papa, okay, now we're going to have a similar story that shows the same idea. Havgilahu ginta, okay, he had a garden. Shadebu bizrani, here you really see the comparison. He planted seeds, v'lo tzamach, and nothing grew. Bai rachame, again, we're back to the bai rachame, okay, again, the literary connection between that's in the previous stories. He asked for rachamim from God, ata mitra utzamach, the rain came and it grew. Amar hainu de Rav Asi. When this happened, he said, oh, this is just like Rav Asi's midrash about the creation where the grass was stuck underneath and then only once prayer, right? This is how the world works, right? You need a combination of work and prayer, right? And the combination of that brings things to happen. And it's, again, goes back to these ideas about belief in God. That's all part of how things happen and not the way the Roman Caesar and his daughter wanted to see things. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava, Hashisu'ah. Okay, here we go to a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim in chapter 14 when it talks about what you can't eat. Remember the kashrut comes up in two places. Don't eat from the ma'ale gerah mafrisei parsa, hashisu'ah, et hagamal, et arnevet, et hashafan. We usually read that pasuk is from the people who chew their cuds and the one with split hooves. Hashisu'ah, which we assume means some sort of splitting of the hooves also, because shosat shesa comes up also in the other section. And the gamal and the arnevet and the shafan. Don't eat those three kind of animals, okay? Because they're ma'ale gerah, but they're not mafrisei parsa. But according to Rav Chanan bar Rava, the shisu'ah is a briyah b'fnei atzma. It goes with the gamal part of the pasuk. Don't eat from those. There's ones that are ma'ale gerah or mafrisei parsa, like the shisu'ah, the gamal, the shafan, the arnevet, that you can't eat. What kind of creature is this? Well, sheyesh la shnei gabim v'shnei shidraot. It has two backs and two vertebrae. Okay, that's very strange, right? Well, also back to these very strange creatures. V'chim Moshe Rabbeinu kenigni hava. Was he a hunter? O balistri haya. Was he shooting with arrows? Mikan tshuva la'omer ein Torah min hashamayim. Okay, there's no way Moshe knew about this creature, the shisu'ah. It's not like he went to wild places hunting. That wasn't what his job was in life. And the fact that he knew this must mean that Torah's min hashamayim, okay? God, the Torah is God-given. It wasn't like Moshe wrote the Torah. Okay, you see all these polemics in this daf. Amarle Rav Chisda Rav Tachli bar Ravina Zilk. Okay, this is a very strange line. Rav Chisda says to Rav Tachli bar Ravina Zilk tov knigi ubalistri ba'agadatech uprasha. These are two words that nobody really knows what they are. Go write them in your Sefer Agadot, okay, which I guess was some sort of dictionary they had, because that's what he's saying. Write them in your Sefer of Agadatot, write down the words, and translate them so that people know what they are. Okay, now because he has this comment on something else, and we're going to get off on another tangent, which again connects in some way, but we'll see how. Chameshet Sarnei Plishtim. Okay, there's 5 of the Plishti officers. Ha'azati, and it's really like these 5 areas of where the Philistines lived. Ha'azati, va'ashdodi, va'ashkeloni, ha'giti, va'ekroni, va'ha'avim. Now, if you read carefully, okay, not exactly what all the names are, but you might have noticed something strange in the pasuk. It says 5, and there's actually 6 listed. Ha'azati, ashdodi, ashkeloni, giti, ekroni, va'avim. Amar chamisha v'chashiv shita. He said there's 5, and then the pasuk said 6. So that's counted 6. So Amar Rabbi Yonatan, al-runki shalahem chamisha. The important ones among them were the first 5. The 6th was not important at all. Who's the Avim? Amarle Rav Chisda Rav Tachli bar Ravina Ktuv arnaki ba'agadetechu persha. The same thing Rav Chisda says. Go write that word arunki, because that's a word nobody really knows. It means the important one. Okay. Upliga de Rav. Now we're going to get off about the Avim. There's a machloket between this interpretation and Rav's interpretation. To Amarav, Avim mitemam ba'u. They came from Yemen. They were not Plishtim. They ended up living in the Philistine territory, but they weren't actually Philistines. And that's why it said Chamishah Sarnei Plishtim. And it wasn't counting that one because they came from Yemen. Tanya Namihachi bright to support that Aviv mitemam ba'u. Okay, the Avim came from Teman, but Lamanik Kashman Avim. Why were they called Avim? We're now going to darshan their name. Either She'ivtu et Mekomam, because their place got destroyed, wiped out. That's when they left. Davar Acher, Avim, She'ivu le'Elohim Arbeh. This is a play on Ayin and Aleph. Ivu with an Aleph, Avim is with an Ayin. Ivu is they desired other gods. That's why they came to the Philistines, because they were big idol worshippers. Davar Acher, Avim, Shekolo Re'eotam Achosto Avit. Anyone who sees them gets immediately scared. Now, Amar of Yosef, why did they get scared? Apropos all our descriptions of these strange creatures. Ilu shitzrei darishine lechol chavechad. They had 16 rows of teeth, so they were pretty scary. They had a lot of teeth, and it scared people. This goes back to, by the way, if we talk about literary connections, the teeth that fell out when the Aryeh from Be'ilai came. We had the teeth of the kosher animals, right? They don't have teeth in the front of their mouths. There's a lot of teeth going on here also. Okay. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Harbei mikra'ot sheruyin lisaref vehein hein gufei Torah. All right, the Maharal says these were cannibals. Thank you for reminding me about that. That's why they had these big teeth. They were eating humans. Okay. Harbei mikra'im sheruyin lisaref. There's all these psukim that when you look at them at first glance, you say, we should burn the Torah because of these psukim. Like, what on earth are they doing there? Now, you might be surprised that they're going to burn the Torah on these psukim, but they're going to say these psukim make no sense at first glance. But, hein gufei Torah. But they're actually essential verses of the Torah. Okay? And this really teaches you, and I think the lesson to be learned from this is that, and maybe something, right, you really need to delve into, it's a good promotion for Daf Yomi, or maybe not, because Daf Yomi, you don't delve into it enough, but yes, to understand everything, right, with Daf Yomi really does give you the perspective on everything. You start to understand where things come from, and you have to understand things properly and not just look at them at first glance and say, oh, that makes no sense, right? There's so many things we do in our religion that you might say that makes no sense, but when you start to learn it and you see the source for it, then you start to appreciate it. So these are, you're going to be a little surprised by them, but let's see. Ha'avim hayoshvim b'chatzirim al Aza. Okay, there's all these psukim in the Torah that describe things that go on in other nations, and they seem really totally disconnected. So this is a pasuk. It's in Sefer Dvarim, the second chapter. The Avim live in Chatzirim until Aza, and the Kaftorim, Yotzim Kaftor Hishmidum. The Kaftorim destroyed the Avim, Ve'yeshvu Tachtam, and they lived in their place. Okay, why is the Torah telling us this? It seems ridiculous. My nafkalamina, what does that have to do with me? Well, Mida Ashbe Avimelech LaAvraham. Now, Avimelech was from the Philistines. Now, when he swore to Avraham, Im Tishkor Liun Lenini Ulinachti, right? He made Avraham take an oath, and they swore that they would have a pact. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Leitu Kaptorim Livku Me'avim Tahainu Plishtim. Okay, this holds that the Avim were Philistines. They say God said have the Kaptorim conquer the Philistines, so that when we got to the land, Leitu Yisrael Livku Kaptorim. We can't conquer the Philistines because we made a pact. So God had the Kaptorim conquer them so that we could then conquer the land. So this is all about conquering the land and how God made everything happen so that we could. Another one. Okay, that was because of a pact that Avraham made with Avimelech. Now we're going to have a different problem, which is this pasuk. Ki chashbon ir Sichon melech HaAmori. This is in Parsha Chukat, which you might have just read yesterday, depending on where you live, 2 days ago. Ki chashbon ir Sichon melech HaAmori v'hu necham b'melech Moav. Okay, Chashbon is the city of Sichon, king of the Amorites, which he fought against king of Melech Moav and conquered Moav. My nafkamina. Why do we need to know this? Well, the Amar Lu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, here by a God-given commandment, it says, Al Tatzeret Moav. We're not allowed to attack Moav. So Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Leite Sichon, Leipuk My Moav, Leite Yisrael, Leipuk Sichon. So Sichon would conquer Moav so that we could conquer their land. V'hainu Damar Rav Papa, Amon Moav Taharu b'Sichon. They were cleansed by Sichon, meaning Sichon paved the way for us to be able to conquer those areas. Tzedonim Yikra'u, last pasuk for today. Tzedonim, oh no, we have two more, sorry. Tzedonim Yikra'u leChermon Siryon. So the Tzedonim call their area where they live in the Hermon, they call it Siryon, and the continuation of the pasuk is the Emori called their land Snir. Now, this is strange because Tana Snir v'Siryon meharei Eretz Yisrael. Snir and Siryon are mountains in Israel, and why are these places outside of Israel calling their mountains by the name of Snir and Siryon? Melamed shekol echad ve'echad miyumot ha'olam halach u'bana lo krach gadol la'atzmo. Each of the other nations went out and built themselves a big city. Ve'he'elalo al shem harei Eretz Yisrael. And they called it in the name of the mountains of Israel, Lalamdecha, to teach you, shafilu harei Eretz Yisrael chavivim alumot ha'olam. Even the mountains in Israel are beloved by other nations, and that's why they call them by our mountains. Kayotzebo. Likewise, they say ve'eta'am he'evir oto la'arim. My nafkamina. Why does it tell us with Yosef? If you remember, with the Egyptians and the whole thing with the food, it starts telling us this whole system that Yosef instituted, or what's the word? I can't think of the word I want to say, but basically set up a whole system for the Egyptians, and it said, and he took them out of their cities and moved them around to other cities. Who cares? So, Delo Likru La'achiv Galvata, he didn't want the Mitzrayim to call the Jews, when they came to Mitzrayim, to call them Galvata, you're exiled people, because they were all exiled themselves. And it was a way to make his brothers feel comfortable when they were going to come into the land. Okay, so we now understood all those psukim. Okay, what were they doing in the Torah? There was a purpose for them. So you might say, what's the purpose of these psukim? Right, this goes back to Torah Min Hashamayim, right, that there's some broader idea here. It goes back to the idea of Hashgacha that we talked about in the beginning of the daf, that there's a broader plan, right, and God has his, both created the world, created these unique creatures which show God's presence in the world, right, even though you don't really see them, but we believe in them. And right, so we started with the stories of Rabbi Yehoshua and the Caesar and the daughter of the Caesar, and from there we went to, we kind of got off going back to the animals, but we circled back to creation of the world, because we talked about the shore with one horn that Adam Harishon brought as a sacrifice. From there we got to all different things about how unique creation of the world was, that certain things happened that were, they were born at full form. We had how the grass did this kaf chomer, and God was so proud of the creatures that he created, right? The grass, and then we had the Yarech, the moon, which then God, figured out how to resolve, but then ended up, right? In other words, when the moon asked the question, God said, fine, you'll be smaller, but then God had to actually atone for that. From there we got to the other problem with the contradiction of, right, we started with one contradiction of it was first called the Gadol, then it became the Katan. That was the whole story of the moon. And then we had about the grass, how did it come out? And we got to there the beauty of how God wants the tefillot of tzaddikim. And from there we got to the Shisuan, how is this unique creature? It must be God basically wrote the Torah, not Moshe, because there's no way Moshe would have known what that is. And then we had all those. From there we got to the words, Knigari Balistri, was he a hunter, was he an archer? And then basically, put that in a dictionary. From there we got to another story about the Avim, and put that word Arunki in the dictionary. And from there we got to all these psukim about the Avim, and then other nations that were conquered. And why are we talking about this in the Torah? And it's because it all comes back to the Jewish people. And it was all God, and really what it's showing is God's hashgacha in the world, that he made it, that this nation would conquer that nation, so that we would, ultimately the plan was so that we could get into the land of Israel. And with that, we finish for today. Even the story of Yosef really is a lead up to the whole getting into the land, right? If you view that story as the beginning of the Galut, which then brought back to the getting into the land of Israel, or really connects to our getting into the land of Israel and God's hashgacha in the world, which is kind of hidden, but it is there, right? Which leads back to the beginning stories where they didn't really see God and they wanted to see God. Well, we see God in a different way. With all those ideas, we've finished today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.